Hi, everyone. Welcome to, thank you and welcome. Thanks for coming to the HLS Student Animal Legal Defense Fund's second day of Animal Law Week. If you want to know more about our events throughout the week, you can go to that URL right there and get more events info. Today, we are so grateful to have David Wolfson here today to speak to us about an issue that is so very important to so many of us here, which is legal protections for farmed animals. David Wolfson is a partner at the law firm of Milbank, Tweed, Hadley, and McCloy. He's based at the New York office and is a member of the corporate group. Perhaps more importantly to us today, he is highly committed to animal rights activism. As an adjunct professor at NYU Law, he has taught both animal law and farmed animal law and policy. Mr. Wolfson has also written a number of pieces on abuses of farmed animals and the surrounding legal landscape. So we're so excited to hear from him today about legal protections for farmed animals. So let's all please give him a round of applause.
Thank you. Just to give you a little more background to understand how I do animal protection work and also work at a large law firm like Milbank, because I guess a fair number of you are law students and you will probably, whether you believe it or not, will actually end up at a large law firm at some point in your life. I do corporate law mergers and acquisitions, but I do pro bono work as well. I've been at Milbank over 20 years now. And I've done pro bono work in the animal protection area, so I've represented groups that you might be familiar with, such as HSUS, Farm Sanctuary, Mercy for Animals, Compassion Over Killing, Compassion on World Farming, in various things such as administrative challenges, ballot initiatives like the one that's going on in Massachusetts at the moment, legislation, litigation, and so on. And as was said, I teach at NYU. I'm delighted I'm also going to be able to teach a class at Harvard Law School this fall, I believe. So for those of you who have an interest, there will be a class on farmed animal law. And basically some of the things that I'll be talking about today will be the subject of that class this fall. So I don't want to talk for too long because I know you guys leave around 10:02, and I want to make sure you have time for questions. And it's obviously a very big area that I could talk about. So what I think I'm going to do very briefly is I want to just to describe the issue that we're talking about, what the problem is, why we even care about it. 2, briefly describe how the law works in this area to the extent that you guys don't understand or know about that yet. 3, talk about some of the changes that have happened. And then 4, just bring us back to the modern day about what people are doing to try and fix the problem. So what is the problem? The problem is obviously how animals that are raised for food or food production are treated in the United States and worldwide, but I'm going to focus on the United States for the purpose of this talk. It's a very large number of animals. I think you guys have a sense of the number, but it's very hard to get. The number is, it used to be 10 billion, it's now like 9.5 billion, just over 9 billion animals that are raised for food and food production and essentially killed every year in the United States. That's whether it's for pork or for beef or the overwhelmingly large number of animals, which are chickens, either for egg production or because we choose to eat them. And I think something like 90% of the animals that we raise for food in the US are chickens. And this does not include fish or any of the seafood that we're talking about. And every time I do this talk, I always say, 9 billion animals is such a big number, there's really no way that we can comprehend that. They try and do it, I think it's like 262 chickens a second, or there are all these different ways of trying to grasp onto it, but it's just too big a number. But one thing I'd like to point out in terms of the issue of the importance of the subject is that they not only that they represent the overwhelming number of animals that we actually interact with in our society. So if you think about how we interact with animals in our society, we have them in our homes, cats and dogs, we have them in circuses, we have them in zoos, we use them for medical research, we use them for fur, we use them in circuses. There are some animals we hunt. I mean, if you just try and think of all the animals that you can think of that we have an interaction with, and then you sort of put them in the middle of the room in a big pile, and what you basically have, I think, is everything but the animals that are running around in the forest that we're leaving alone. And then you put farmed animals into the pile. Of that entire pile, the total number is about 98% farmed animals. So it's not just that 9 billion animals is a lot, it's like it dwarfs everything else. And that doesn't mean that anyone who's focused on how dogs and cats are treated, or horses, or vivisection, or any of these other issues, that doesn't mean those issues aren't important, but it does, I think, make the point that how farmed animals are treated is particularly important, and how the law relates to those animals is particularly important, because if we come to a conclusion, which I will try and persuade you of in a very short period of time, that essentially there is really practically no law for farmed animals of any worth in terms of how they're treated, then we're sort of come to a conclusion that there's really very little law about animals, full stop, because that's sort of it. That's the whole thing. I think most of you know how animals are raised for food. You know, there's a lot of good literature, a lot of good movies on this. I mean, generally, it's accepted that a large number of animals are raised in very inhumane ways, whether it be the things that we know about, like chickens in battery cages that are so small that they can't turn around and spread their wings, or veal crates, which are being phased out somewhat, or gestation crates for pigs in terms of how they're bred. Again, a small crate where they can't turn around, or typical mutilations that are done without anesthetic, or the genetic inbreeding of animals so that most of them grow so quickly that if you actually let them even have like a fifth of their normal lifespan, they just sort of fall over and unable to move because their bodies are too big for their bones to even handle, or they have heart attacks and so on. So there's no natural lifespan of a farmed animal anymore. It's one of those things, if you go to Farm Sanctuary and you actually look at the pigs they've rescued, they're really, really, really big, and they actually have a hard time even moving when they get to a certain age because they're just not designed for that. It's obviously hard to see what goes on in these institutions. There's probably a fair number of you are aware of how these laws have been written in certain states to restrict the ability of people to see what's going on. But, and also when you're just dealing with that many animals, it's hard to envision how you can really have a system that makes sure that they're treated well, even if you try really hard. I mean, slaughtering large numbers of animals on a daily basis is not a job that is something that I think anyone want to do, and it's not a job that's easy to do, even if you try to do it very well, to do it humanely. So the result of that, and this focus of this talk, is very much on the ethics of animal use and farm for food, and the result of that is a lot of people have become very uncomfortable with raising so many animals for food in ways that are very ethically questionable. And there's obviously some people who would argue that there's no need to eat animals. That, you know, just to make that point at the beginning, that we can choose to be vegans or at least vegetarians or reduce meat consumption. And then there's a discussion of, well, if we're going to do it, how would we do it better? But in addition to the ethical issues, I think you are also aware of a number of other issues that are integrating with farmed animal treatment nowadays. Number one, primarily, is environmental issues. Huge amount of environmental waste that comes out of pig farms, that comes out of chicken farms, and so on, that are causing a great deal of problems. You also are probably aware of the relationship between meat production and climate change. And there are different statistics, and I'm never sure really which one to point to. There are some that would suggest that meat consumption is the leading cause of climate change when you break things down. There are others that suggest, no, it's behind other things. It's like number 2 or number 3. Anything from 18% to 35%, basically. But it's a very, very large number, predominantly from beef cattle is the main reason. And then there are also nutrition issues surrounding that. I'm not suggesting that eating meat per se is harmful to you, but the way that America eats meat and the type of diet that we have, and as other cultures take on the meat diet, how they start to get, there's a lot of evidence that suggests the amount of animal protein that we consume has negative health effects. And so you wrap that all together, and I actually got into this issue because I was caring about the animals, and I found as time has gone by that it's also become an incredibly important issue for all these other reasons. So that's the problem, and that's the problem in the US. We'll talk about the US. Obviously, that's a problem in China, where meat production is growing dramatically compared to historical amounts. It's a problem in Brazil. It's a problem in India. It's a problem in a lot of places. So how does the law treat the way animals are produced for food? And I think, I don't know how much any of you know in the room, but my guess is that most of you probably have some awareness of how animals are raised for food. Most of you probably are not particularly comfortable with that. I think the public generally has some awareness that it's not pleasant, but I don't think that they want to look too closely at it because it's not pleasant. But I think there's probably some presumption that there's some legal system that deals with it, that it's probably not perfect, it probably has enforcement issues, but there's at least something that exists out there to regulate how animals are raised for food. And I would posit that that's really not the case. And just to take you through a very quick survey of this, I I break it up into three areas, where the animal is raised for food, which is the majority of an animal's life, the transport of the animal to wherever the animal's going, and then ultimately the death of the animal. An animal being raised for food. There is no federal law that details how an animal should be treated in terms of ethical considerations when it's raised for food. There are no requirements on how anesthesia for mutilations. There's no requirement on cage space. There's no requirement of food or water. There's just no requirements. And so the USDA that we would typically think of as the entity that would go in and deal with farm animals, I mean, it's USDA, right? Department of Agriculture. Surely they'll do something. They actually have no statutory authority to regulate in this area. At one point, they tried to under one statute, and an administrative court said, you realize you don't actually have any authority here. So there is no federal law of any type that says how an animal should be treated while being raised for food. So then you go to the states, and so obviously you've got a lot of states, and all the state laws are somewhat different. And you basically have two types of state law. You have the type of law that says, in a very vague way, that no animal should be unjustifiably injured, and if you do, it's a misdemeanor most likely. But those statutes are criminal laws that are enforced by district attorneys, and the likelihood that you're going to get a local DA in an area where there's a large amount of farm production to come along and use a criminal statute and get on the farm and have evidence to prosecute, very, very low. And more importantly, this concept of what unnecessary or justifiable suffering is so open that there are indications that courts will just say, well, raising for food is a necessary suffering or justifiable suffering. And so there are actually no cases that I'm really aware of that have had any real success at the state level or with anti-cruelty laws of prosecuting any normal or common farming practice. But those statutes are actually very much the minority now, because what happened about 25 years ago when I was actually in law school is that the states started to amend their anti-cruelty laws, their criminal cruelty codes for animals, and it was a very deliberate act. And they went state by state, and they basically added a piece of language at the end of every statute. So it said it is a crime to torture, maim, injure an animal, unless it is a common farming practice, a normal farming practice, an accepted farming practice, or a customary farming practice. And in a period of about 10 years, that went from 15 states to 30 states. And I think now I've lost track. It's like 35 states have something like that. So what does that mean? Well, it obviously means that, one, whatever the industry decides to do to farmed animals is a common practice. That is, the industry determines the meaning of the definition. So if enough people in the industry do something, then it is by definition exempt from the statute. So I always use the example of, imagine if you had a pollution law that said it is a crime to pollute unless you're polluting in a manner that is common or normal to the industry. I think that's sort of meaningless. So the bottom line is the industry has specifically altered the statutes to exempt out their own activity. Some states are particularly specific in that they actually say the common practice is, common farming practice is defined by whatever's going on in the county. So it doesn't even have to be in the state. If enough people in the county are doing it, that would be sufficient. So the result of that, when you look over all the states in terms of how animals are raised for food in industrialized farming, in factory farms, battery cages, and so on, is that there are no cases attempting to argue whether or not any of these practices are humane or not, because it's simply outside the reach of the state law. And so the result of that is that when animals are raised for food, there is no federal or state law. When they're transported, there is a federal law, a 28-hour law, it's called, which has a limit on how long you can transport an animal. But the problem is that no one can quite work out who's responsible for the enforcement of it. It says in the statute that the Department of Justice is, the Attorney General, and the USDA is sort of involved. And I'm actually working on a matter now where they're trying to find one case in the last 50 years where the statute's ever been enforced. And I think there's maybe one or two. So that's really not happening. And then you have the Humane Slaughter Act, which deals with slaughter, which is a federal law. And that is a law that says when you slaughter an animal, before you slaughter the animal, you have to make sure that they are unconscious and therefore not able to feel pain. The first problem with that statute is it doesn't apply to chickens. Chickens are specifically exempt. So if you go back to the pile of animals, that means that 98% of all the animals that we're talking about for food is exempt from the slaughter law. And also ritual slaughter is exempt. And then the final issue is a problem that all of you will be familiar with, whether it be environmental law or any type of law, is that the issue of enforcement is very, very difficult. Having someone stand in front of a killing floor where people are slaughtering cow after cow after cow after cow, and relying on them to constantly monitor and make sure that every animal is killed humanely is a very difficult thing. There's a lot of evidence from Undercover Investigations that the industry does a good job of sort of moving the inspector around to avoid things. There's arguments that the inspectors are essentially in the pocket of industry because it's essentially a self-regulated. I mean, there are a whole host of issues. But the result is that's the law as it relates to farmed animals, which is why I used to joke that I became a farmed animal law expert because there was no law to be an expert of, and it seemed like a really good path to take. The good news is that it's not quite as bad as that anymore. Starting about 15, 16 years ago, animal protection advocates decided to try and make things better. And the problem was how to do that. There was no likelihood of passing any federal statute at that point. And it was also impossible to pass any state legislative bill of any type, because any state that had significant agricultural activity had an agricultural committee, and if you went to the agricultural committee, they would simply knock you out. And there are some very interesting hearings for people who are interested in this. There's a fascinating a testimony on this stuff and how it goes. So the animal protection advocates did what a lot of social justice activists do, but what I think animal protection advocates do better than anyone, is they decided to go to sort of a form of citizen democracy, which is the ballot initiative, which the United States is a particularly unique country in terms of how it's utilized. And so they started in Florida, and as a result of successful initiatives in Florida and Arizona and California, they've now passed a number of laws in a number of states focusing on very specific activities. So to be specific, they have prohibited what is known as the battery cage, that is the cramming of egg-laying birds into small cages. Gestation crates, that is breeding pigs into cages they can't turn around in. And veal crates, which is young calves that are put into crates they can't turn around. And they prohibited that in a large number, well, I don't know actually, I wonder what the number is. I'm going to say it's probably like 10 states, something like that. Most of that from ballot initiatives or the threat of ballot initiatives. So one way of looking at that is that's great progress. The other way of looking at it is there's a whole host of intensive confinement practices that are problematic, and at this point we've barely scratched the surface. But what does it show us? It shows us, one, that the public, when given the opportunity to vote on these issues, is supportive, which was something that was not presumed. It also shows us that these initiatives can have very significant consequences, because when the industry sees them, they actually start to change their behavior as a result. So when the Florida and Arizona ballot initiatives happened, Florida was just a gestation crate and Arizona was the gestation crate and the veal crate. The industry, the pig industry itself, Smithfield, said, we're going to get rid of the gestation crate. And then they didn't, and then they said they would again, and then they didn't, and now they're saying they will again. But the point is, it started a process. Similarly with the battery cage in California, which was in over 60% of the vote. Now the battery cage industry seems to be moving away from the battery cage. At this point, for those people who are very involved in this issue, it would be totally appropriate to ask the question, well, is the battery cage really being prohibited? And what is the replacement for the battery cage? And are the animals being really treated that much better in a very big cage or a big crate? And how much protection do you have as a result of it? And those are all excellent questions. And the answer is, I personally think it's better, but I don't think it's brilliant by any means. So what we now have, when you look at the issue, is you still have a real lack of legal activity in terms of legal protections, a smattering of laws at the states, and a sort of question about what's going to happen next. The ballot initiatives are still going on, as you guys know better than anyone. Massachusetts has a ballot initiative this fall. You are probably aware that Massachusetts does not have the largest agricultural industry in the states. And there's a lot of questions aimed at the ballot initiative as like, why bother doing it here? And what's unique about this ballot initiative is the first ballot initiative to not only ban the cruel confinement of gestation crates and battery cages and veal crates, but to also ban the sale of certain products from those systems in Massachusetts. There is a law in California that bans the sales of certain eggs, but that was a legislative law after the ballot initiative. This would be the first ballot initiative that actually passed an economic restriction. And so that's an interesting development. There was an attempt 2 years ago to go to DC and pass a federal law. And that was interesting because actually the Humane Society of the United States struck a deal with the United Egg Producers, the biggest egg industry group. And they agreed they would go to DC together, hand in hand, and they agreed on exactly what law they would pass and what the cage sizes would be and the size and how many years for the phase out. And it was going to take a long time, according to some people. I mean, appropriately, I think it was envisioned 15 years, something like that. I mean, a long time. And they went down to DC and they got nowhere. And they got nowhere because of all the other animal industry groups, the pigs and the beef and everyone else who said, we don't want any federal legislation on animal protection because at this moment there isn't any and we view anything happening as worse. So we now got actually a very interesting situation going on in the terms of the legal world. And I posit this question to you guys to think about is, and this is from my own view, I don't really know what the right thing to do is anyway. Like, if the state laws that have been passed have been very good, but they're incredibly limited. And as you probably can think about, raising animals is not a limited thing. It's an incredibly big thing. You've got lots of cows and pigs and chickens and turkeys and geese and ducks, and there are lots of stages of their upbringing to focus on, and there are lots of questions about how much food and how much water and how much light and how they should be taken out and how they should be caught, how they should be moved, how they should be killed, what happens with a new genetic strain, what happens in 5 years when they do something else. This is not an area that is going to be easily regulated by passing state criminal laws through ballot initiative state by state. That just doesn't work that way. This is actually an area, which you guys in law school are very familiar with, that just cries out for some type of regulatory structure. Some type of big federal law with some type of an administrative agency that has the power to promulgate regulations, enforcement power, the ability to go in without search warrants, the ability to constantly change the regulations as new science comes along or as new practices are developed. So in one stage, you think, well, if we want to make animals get treated well and looked after, isn't that what we should do? I should run down to DC and try and do that. That is, for me, the worst thing that could ever happen at this moment. And the reason that's the worst thing is because who would be responsible for enforcing that statute? It would be the United States Department of Agriculture. Who would be responsible for drafting the regulations? And how would we challenge it? And for any of you who are interested in administrative law, there's a perfect analogy of this as the Animal Welfare Act, which is a federal statute that had requirements on how chimpanzees should be receiving psychological enrichment when they were in zoos and circuses, or dogs would receive exercise and so on. And every time a regulation came out, the animal protection movement felt that it didn't go far enough because they felt that industry had controlled the agency process. And any time they challenged it, it became very difficult to challenge because either they didn't have standing, which is a unique and interesting problem in the area of animal protection, or if they had standing, as I'm sure you guys are aware, it is so hard to overturn a regulatory a regulation on the basis of arbitrary and capricious, or the agency had enough discretion and so on. So while clearly regulatory structure is the way to go, although we could also question, is it really possible to raise animals well under an administrative structure and have them humanely treated? And I'm happy to talk about that. It's a hard question. I don't think it would be a particularly great success at this moment to do that. Now, Europe has done a better job at this, although a lot of people are criticizing it. But for some reason, there seems to be a different political situation in terms of the way regulations work. So what seems to be happening, even though these state ballot initiatives, is that it's all sort of gone different now. And this is probably something that you guys are aware of in other areas, the question of like how change even happens in the United States now, how social justice change happens, how people achieve things. It used to be when I was younger that you just got a lot of people and you marched in Washington and you passed a federal law and then everything changed. And that was great. Apart from that, doesn't seem to happen anymore. One, because I don't think anyone thinks that there will be any law passed in Washington, and no matter how many people march there, especially not this year. And two, because it's just that people are very questionable about whether that works as an enforcement method. And three, because people seem to have gone somewhere else. And so where have they gone? And you guys are, I think, familiar with it. They've gone to things like consumer purchasing power, consumer campaigns against industries that are asked to no longer purchase from battery-caged facilities. And you see HSUS has done terrific campaigns where they've got cruise lines and universities and retailers and everyone to not buy these products. It's a great tactic. It's a little uncertain how much you move the market, how far do you have to move the market, do you move all the market, do you leave some animals stranded, how does it work? But that's a technique. Similarly, all this sort of social networking and transparency and communication and about all of that stuff seems to be a very big tactic. And then the other area that seems to be taking off is the area of venture capital investments in alternatives to meat. Whether it be what we are now calling cultured meat, because I think sort of grown in the vat meat didn't work very well. People didn't want to eat grown in the vat meat, so I guess we call it cultured meat. The idea of cloning meat cells, or creating products that are so like meat but are not from meat but are from plant-based protein that no one can tell the difference. And so you have Hampton Creek with the mayonnaise that didn't have egg in it, which was so successful at first. Hellman sued them to stop calling it mayonnaise, and then they decided to put out their own line of mayonnaise without eggs, which is a victory. Or chicken that's made from things that aren't chicken, just chicken, Beyond Beef, ice cream, milk, and so on. And in the M&A world, which I'm involved with, I've actually spent a lot of time with people who are very heavily involved in the venture capital side of this. And there is more interest and more money going into these type of things, because it seems that the time of compassionate consumerism has arisen. The Economist had a piece a few months ago where they noted that in the last 5 years, ethical consumerism, buying products based upon some type of ethical determination, is at its highest level that it's ever been, especially amongst millennials. And what's amazing is that it's grown in the last 5 years in the face of an economic recession in large part. And yet people are still making purchasing decisions in that way. So those are all of the things. So, of course, it's very exciting and very encouraging, and lots of things have happened. But at the same time, the meat production is still very large in this country. I think it's 3 to 4% of people are vegans in this country, which is my colleague John Lovin, who taught a class here this semester, likes to point out that 5% of Americans thought that the lunar landings were a hoax. So there are actually more of them than there are vegans. So just put that in context. And then obviously this incredible growth of meat production in Latin America and in Southeast Asia and in Asia is something to be focused on. So that's all of these issues are things that if you guys want to take the class are going to be things that we'll be talking about, and a whole bunch of other things as well, including like international trade issues, WTO, GATT, as I say, the environmental issues, ag-gag issues in terms of the ability to see in places, undercover investigations, everything. But so that's sort of the problem. That's the legal structure, which I would still say is incredibly deficient, if not pretty much non-existent. But an incredible amount of focus and change, and some desire to do something different. So it's almost 22, so I'm going to stop at this point and be happy to answer any questions that people have.
So if you want to call on people, I'll hand the mic off to different people. But before the Q&A, can we all just give Mr. Wolfson a big round of applause for talking to us? And also a really quick plug about tomorrow, something that you mentioned, the Ballot initiative in Massachusetts. If you want to learn more about that, please join us tomorrow for a talk by Nancy Perry, who has been a leader in this field. It will be in WCC 10:15 at noon. And now I'll stop talking and let you guys ask questions.
Yeah. I think it's recording is the thing.
Thank you for coming to speak to us.
Pleasure.
So you mentioned state ballot initiatives. I'm just curious how well you guys do in state ballot initiatives in states where agriculture is one of the main industries, or do you guys do better sort of in states like Massachusetts? Have you had success in like Iowa or states like that?
It's a great question. There are obviously a limited number of states that do the initiative. So like some of the big ones like Wisconsin, for example, I don't believe they have a ballot initiative. We have done actually quite well, but it was a very sort of thought out process. We went to Florida first, where there were I think 500 pigs and banned the gestation crate. Then we went to Arizona, where there were more pigs but like no veal calves, and we banned the veal crate. And then we went to California, and no one can say California is anything other than an agricultural state. So to have the success that we had in California with the eggs and the the dairy, because of the veal, was very, very significant. Then we went into places like Ohio and Michigan and had success, and Colorado and had success. We didn't actually run ballot initiatives in any of those states. We went in and we said, we're going to run a ballot initiative. And then we struck legislation that had a longer phase-out period as part of the deal. That said, we haven't gone into the heartland. And that's one of the reasons, obviously, that these economic restrictions become so powerful. Because if you're just shutting off corners of the market when no one's producing or producing small amounts, so what? But if you're actually shutting off very large purchasing areas who can no longer buy those type of products, it becomes very key. There were constitutional challenges to doing that in California that went nowhere. I know that the opposition in Massachusetts has claimed there are these constitutional issues, but so far any of the challenges have not been successful.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much.
Pleasure.
I had three things I was curious about. The first, the California move to ban the sale of products, and also the Massachusetts initiative, which will do that. I know that there has been a successful ban in the sale of shark fins. Mm-hmm. However, I worry that there will be complaints about this on the basis of interstate commerce
Right.
laws. I don't know whether that's been faced already.
Yeah.
Second thing I'm confused about is our ballot initiative here in Massachusetts is asking for the enhanced crates, these going a little bit bigger. But simultaneously, we're looking to companies to make pledges to go cage-free. So this seems to be an expensive and unnecessary middle step before going from battery to some type of cage-free. And I've forgotten the third thing.
Okay, that's good, because I could only remember two things, so it's good. The first thing, the interstate commerce issue has arisen in California, and the federal courts held that it was not an issue. Interestingly, the reason that law was passed was that after the ballot initiative was passed, the egg industry in California said, you better pass this law, because otherwise you're going to drive us out of business. So it had a lot of support from the industry itself, which is what happens to the people, the producers in that state. I don't know quite the language in Massachusetts, but the way the gestation crate and the battery cage bans typically work is the gestation crate ban is written in a way that sounds like you're only banning a small crate. It says it's illegal to confine an animal in a manner that they are unable to turn around without touching the side. So what you do, arguably, is give the producer the ability to ban it, to just build a bigger crate. But the economics are such that the moment you restrict them from building the crate that's this size, they all go to group housing. And every state that we've done the initiatives in and passed the law, they just move to group housing, because once you make it a little bit bigger, the economics don't work. The battery cage seems to be a similar thing. And the other thing that's going on with the battery cage is it seems that the industry, with this whole growth of free-range eggs, which again, I'm happy to talk about. Oh, and that reminds me, I forgot to talk about labeling. That's a whole other area that's a big issue here, is cruelty-free, humane certified, all of that stuff. But it seems that and part of this is the limitation of the ballot. If you write a ballot initiative and it's an up or down vote, you cannot put in complicated languages. You cannot make anything difficult. It has to be streamlined and simple, because you can get attacked very easily, and that makes these provisions quite unsatisfying. But the goal is always to move to the next step, and it seems from the ones that have been passed that it does go to the next step. Whether group housing for chickens, like what is a free-range chicken facility, right? And is it great? And is it good enough? And is it something that people should be purchasing from? That is a very complicated question. I personally think it's better than the battery cage, but I recognize that it's still far from perfect. Any other questions? Yes.
Hi, thank you. This is all really interesting. I was just wondering, you mentioned in passing sort of the efforts to suppress people's access to what's going on farms. I was wondering if you could just elaborate on that a little bit.
Right. Well, I think as people know, the industry one of the most effective techniques for the animal protection movement is undercover investigations. They go in, they pretend to be, they are a worker, they don't say where they come from, and they film. And then they release the film. They never pick these places based upon any earlier indication that there's a problem. They just go into any facility. The stuff comes out, it's very damaging. The industry says, okay, we're going to fix this. We're going to make it a crime for anyone to film without our consent in our facilities. And I think 5 states have passed some form of an ag-gag law, although they're all different things. Like one is like you can't film, one is you can't lie on your job application. They're all different. And one has been successfully challenged, I think, in Utah at the lower court, and it's going to be appealed. The question is, what do we make of all of this? In my opinion, which I don't know if probably a lot of people would agree with, I think the big political wave of these ag-gag laws has sort of passed. It was a very popular thing. It got an incredibly large amount of negative publicity. All the newspaper editorials, Jon Stewart, Daily Show, everyone was just like, are you serious? You're telling us that the best way of making the consumer feel comfortable about your product is to make sure that no one can ever see what you do? It just plays really badly politically. I think it's become a very interesting civil liberties issue in terms of the rights, freedom of speech, whistleblower, and all of that. And I think these laws should be challenged. But I personally don't think the laws, whether they're passed or not, will have any real impact upon the animal protection movement. Because I think that the public and the world is at a point now where they already know it's terrible. They already know it needs to be changed. The pressure is so intense, and the industry is changing. And if they somehow think that because they actually stop anyone from ever seeing what's inside the facility, that's going to stop this thing, I personally just don't think it's going to happen. But I would be surprised if they are able to pass, maybe they'll pass a few more, but I don't think it will make a big difference. Yeah.
David, thanks so much. I was wondering, just to dovetail off of Jessica's question, if you can talk about the Planned Parenthood lawsuit that was filed recently with regards to undercover investigations and how that might affect undercover investigations of factory farming.
I would love to if I knew the answer to that question. I'm sorry, I don't know. It's a great question, though.
Hi, so you mentioned with the enactment of these ag-gag laws, obviously ways for animal product industries to maintain their market share. Do you see any ways that they, aside from like the Hampton Creek incident, that these companies would try to enact laws to inhibit the sale of meat replacements? Do you see any?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think it's going to be really interesting. There's so many fascinating questions about this. I mean, so for example, there was a fight for a long time about whether almond milk could be called milk, right? Because the dairy industry was like, no, milk is milk, and almond milk's not milk, it's almond juice or something, and they didn't win that. Similarly, what if we have cultured meat? Does that mean that all of the various subsidies and benefits that apply to animal protein meat that's produced from live animals would suddenly be available for all the cultured meat? And how would the industry react to that? I think there's a whole host of interesting questions, and I'm sure that they will fight it. I mean, the other area you see that the fight significantly is nutrition efforts. Every time the government tries to redo their nutrition guidelines, whether it be a pyramid or a bowl, or how much protein and what types of protein, and whether climate change should be recognized as a negative, whatever, there's a huge fight. So yeah, I think I don't know specifically what, but I'm sure it will be an impact. But it's, again, the industry just doesn't, in my mind, it's just not a successful tactic. I mean, all of these tactics, they're not really slowing down the momentum. There may be like a little weight on one of the horse's legs, but the horse is still running. So I just don't think that's the issue. I think, as I was saying, one of the really interesting issues is going to be like how much labeling takes off, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, how we audit that labeling, whether the industry is able to effectively start auditing itself, and how all of that stuff works. And whether that's even a better world, I don't know.
Right on, right on. And just as you said, slowing down the horse's leg, companies like Hellmann's trying to get a horse in the race by putting the vegan mayo out there. So I'm interested to see how Smithfield might come out and adopt these type of animal-free products. I
mean, and then it gets thorny for vegans, because I know a number of very, very successful vegan alternative meat companies that have been bought out by big behemoth meat companies, and that's part of the VC world and how the world changes or whatever. And I'm very mixed about it. I think we will have to recognize that the role that this type of consumerism or capitalism or whatever it is playing in social justice areas now. I mean, it just is. But it's not perfect, and there are problems with it, but it's happening.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Yeah, Chris.
Just for students here, I know some of these labeling issues are actually more food law than animal law, and the Food Law and Policy Clinic is looking into doing some projects related to some of the standards of identity and things. I want to ask you a question. One thing I found heartening this last year, there was a bill in Arizona that would have tried to do the same, would have taken livestock out of the cruelty code and put them in their own separate but equal, administered by the Ag Department. 87% of Arizonans oppose that, and they end up getting a veto. Republican governor, Republican legislature vetoing this bill. Have you guys ever thought about trying to do the reverse, where you actually do ballot initiatives, where you're trying to jack farmed animals back into the cruelty code?
Yeah, I mean, we've thought about it, but, you know, ballot initiatives they're like the most, you have to, in my view, approach them in the most conservative manner possible. And anything that allows the opposition to argue floodgates, you know, is to be avoided at all costs, because you can't stop the process. You can't, as you see, as you watch the presidential political process, it doesn't matter whether they tell the truth or not, right? That's irrelevant, right? So what you've got to do, so for example, the first law we passed was like a gestation crate initiative, and we said, we're just restricting pigs in the crate, and by the way, this doesn't apply to exhibitions and rodeos, and it doesn't apply to this and that. And went to Arizona, and they were like, they're going to stop 4-H programs. And we're like, no, but we didn't say we weren't going to stop 4-H programs, so then we had to write the next one to say, we're going to stop 4-H programs. So every time they do it, it's so finely crafted and tight, because you cannot have an ambiguity. And so doing something like that is such a broad thing that I think it would be very hard to, it would just be attacked on all sides. And if you watch, you know, the way it's gone, it's like they've always gone bigger when they've done something first. So it was pigs, cows, pig, cows, chickens, pigs, cows, chickens, economic ban. You know, it's like they'll only add one new thing. Now there's 4, but there's only one new thing. So it's always, you know, a careful thing.
What would your next step be in that after this, after Massachusetts? What would
I don't know what the next step would be. I think if you look at what they've done, I mean, if you look at it, they've got Florida, California, Washington, Oregon, I think, and if they get Massachusetts, I wouldn't be surprised if they just sort of went coastal for a bit, you know, because again, the purchasing power is so great. Massachusetts is going to be, I mean, Florida was a little state, I mean, it was a huge state, it's like 500 pigs, and the ripples from that one ballot initiative were humongous. I think if Massachusetts gets passed, which the polling indicates that it will at this point, the ripples from that economic ban will be humongous, you know, and so we'll just see. I've done this long enough to know that anything that I prophesy is wrong, so, you know, that's the way it works. One over there.
I'm Reverend John Millspot, and I'm interested if you would have anything to say about the emerging law around drone technology and how that might intersect with observing goings-on at factory farms.
Well, I know that there's an animal, I know nothing about this area other than I know there's one animal rights group that has purchased a drone and has been attempting to utilize the drone to, you know, go in and see what's going on in these facilities. I imagine, like everything else, it's going to become caught up in all of the privacy and access and constitutional issues around drones. I mean, drones are just like freaky. I mean, Amazon's going to be delivering packages with drones. I mean, I can't even comprehend what in 20 years everyone will presume is totally normal. Again, there's an interesting battle going on in terms of access to information about animal protection. On the one hand, you have the industry trying to shut it down, but on the other hand, is the industry actually opening it up? I mean, whether it be labeling, or whether it be more full disclosure, or whether it be the public wanting to know everything about where the animal is purchased. Is it local? Is it organic? Is it this? Is it that? So you've got this incredible pressure in our society to know more, while the industry is trying to give less. And you can see that even in corporate disclosure, whether it be corporate social disclosure or whatever else. So to me, a tactic that is betting the bank on being able to successfully win the battle by reducing the flow of information in a culture that is driven at this moment into showing more information just doesn't seem like an effective tactic to me.
And we have time for one last question.
Uh-oh. Delcy.
Thanks. This is a follow-on to Chris's first question. I'm wondering how significant you think the common farming exemptions actually are, because as far as I know, they've only come up in about 2 cases, and in the states where there are no such exemptions, I think California is a good example, we're not seeing prosecutions in those states, so it doesn't seem like they're driving much.
I wouldn't say it that way. I mean, you could argue that the fact there's a lack of any prosecutions means they're incredibly effective, right? That is, no one would even think of doing it because they know they're not going to win. It's also very difficult to know what goes on because, as you know, these are all lower court cases that have no recording or whatever. I would agree with the basic point, which, as I was trying to say in the talk, was I can show you the distinction between a common farming exemption statute and a statute without it, but in my mind, they're both equally useless. And I've seen attempts with statutes that don't have common farming exemptions, like in Pennsylvania, that failed, right? No, actually, it had an exemption, but they were trying to argue it wasn't even a common farming practice, and it still failed. So I agree totally with the point that the anti-cruelty statutes are just not the way to change this. I mean, I think, like 10 years ago, I was accused appropriately of being incredibly depressing and negative, and I think that's an absolutely appropriate criticism, because I was like, it's all over, these laws are useless. And there was a bit of an effort to show that these laws weren't useless, and I think they failed. I think these laws are pretty useless. But again, I think as a technique, you're not going to change an industry that is accepted throughout the United States, that gets government funding to do its practices, that everyone agrees these are the practices, and you're going to have a DA go in and say, it's a criminal violation in this county to do this. They're going to be like, what do you mean? Everyone else in the country does it, and the government gives me money to do it. How can you say I'm violating the criminal law? And what DA is going to do that? So it just doesn't work, which goes to the fact that the laws are not working, which goes to the fact that we're moving away from law as even a resolution to this problem, which for me is highly problematic, because that's not, in my view, how animals should be treated. Animals should be worthy of legal protection appropriately as a matter of justice. If they're treated awfully, there should be a law that stops them from being treated awfully, but that doesn't seem to be the way this is playing.
Just at the local DA in Hudson Valley, the one flock raw producer, that's exactly what I saw. He just said, customer taxes, you'll get nowhere, so he's not supposed to go.
And it's not even a common farming exemption in New York. Exactly. Right, so, you know, so I agree with you. I think state anti-cruelty laws are sort of irrelevant in the way this is going to go. All right.
Well, thank you so much.
Great,
again.
thank you very much.